Well, good morning. Hopefully my voice will hold out. This morning we're going to talk about communication in the Bible, or more specifically, I want to talk about how God communicates with us. So the last couple of weeks we've kind of done a theme of who God is, and now I kind of want to move to how God communicates with us. And one of the ways he communicates with us, I don't know if you saw the little video I did on Facebook. One of the ways he communicates with us is through narrative or stories, because stories are that universal form of communication, crosses all lines of race and ethnicity and human backgrounds. Every society uses story to tell information, and the Bible especially uses narrative and story. 43% of the Bible, almost half the Bible, is narrative, is story. And so that works especially well because our brains are hardwired to understand and to take in information through stories. They train us to make sense of random things in our life. And stories do that by taking a certain series of events and putting it into a sequence. And then when we see those events in that sequence, we can begin to see meaning and purpose of those events that are being described. Poetry makes up a third of the Bible, and poetry's a little different. Poems speak through this really compact and dense creative language, and they force us to get out of our rut, whereas stories speak to us in a way that we understand and maybe are within our realm of understanding, I guess. Makes sense because I understand. Poems, on the other hand, say things in a creative way that kind of get us outside of our bubble, and they put things together that don't necessarily usually go together. They force us to get out of our rut, like I said. Like in Isaiah 11, when it talks about the wolf and the lamb imagery, they're together. That's not normal. That's not natural. But the poetry of it is he's showing that there's something that's different about this situation. And the last category of Bible literature is prose or discourse. And this could be letters or speeches or essays. The most obvious one there is, Deuteronomy and Leviticus, those when Moses is giving the law, or even biographies, like if we're going to talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, the Gospels. Those are biographies. Those are giving us information, but they're not necessarily telling a story. Sometimes they are, but discourse is a logical construction. And so, like for example, if I said, hey, have you thought about this thing right here? Have you thought about that? You should also consider how it connects to this other thing over here. And if you make that connection here, then you'll see that this other thing over here is the result. Therefore, you should stop doing this thing here so that this other thing will be the outcome. And it's something that when we read it, we can understand them because it's laying out those. It's laying out the events into a sequence, into that linear argument, so we can follow the argument, and then that argument is going to require a logical response. If we now know that the association between these two things is bad, and the outcome is bad, if we break that association and now do this other thing that is good, we know that the outcome is good. And so let's look at it a little closer. Let's look at narrative in the Bible. Stories are, like I said, a universal form of communication. They're the primary method in which understanding, the fancy word for that is cognition. It's the primary method in the way that cognition takes place in our brain. And cognition is that mental process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through our life. Remember when we were describing God, and we said we can only know God by our experiences in life. We can only know God by what we see. We're humans. We don't have a supernatural understanding of God. We can only understand by what we read and what we experience in nature. And so when we put those things into a logical sequence, what we read, what we experience in nature, then we have an understanding. And that we call that a cognitive process. And so it's the process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought or experience and senses, what we feel. So let's look at this chart here that I have. If we have, I didn't plug in my new wrapper here to change the slides into, there we go. So over here is cognition. This is understanding. This is the story on this side. This is the narrative. This is our physical experiences in our life here on the left. On the right, we can vicariously experience something through a story. And so stories train us to make sense of those random events in our life by putting them into that sequence. When we bring together events into an experience, we can begin to see the meaning and the purpose of those events being described in the Bible stories. So we have the stories over here, and we vicariously experience those things. We call that an experience. And then we understand what's going on in that narrative by the story conveying meaning to us. Sometimes that is subconscious right here, and sometimes it's conscious. Like I can read a story and then understand it without ever, cracking out a pencil and trying to diagram the plot of the story. But sometimes there's some more in-depth things, and this goes for poetry or it goes for narrative as well. There's some things that are underlying there that I can find out that maybe aren't subconscious. Like I could go and look up the history of Hebrew storytelling during the Second Temple era. So from, 400 or 500 BC, when the Jews came back out of captivity and built the Second Temple, there was a specific type of storytelling that was happening during that time. And so those are things that I could learn that are above the level of the sentence. So the sentence means something and it says something, but there also might be more meaning involved in that sentence because of how it was constructed by the authors that constructed it. So without even any conscious effort, though, sometimes these stories will begin to work in us and change how we see the world and how we see other people and how we see ourselves. And so there's three main ways that Bible stories or narratives are given. That is the historical narrative, and there's some common ground between all three of these. So we have historical narrative, we have parables, and we have biographical narrative. And biographical is kind of like the Gospels. It tells us about a certain person, but it does it through story. And so let's look at some of the characteristics of good stories. Good stories have a character who wants something, right? And through those characters, the author can then explore the bigger questions. Remember those bigger questions we're trying to answer? Who am I? Why am I here? What's important in my life? Where am I going when I die? Where did I come from? Who am I? Those questions are then answered through the characters in the story. And so good stories involve conflict, some type of challenge that this character has to overcome. And it's very similar. It's relational. We can relate to those things because it happens in our own life. Anybody here not have any conflict in their life? you know? Yeah, it involves conflict. So there's some type of challenge for us to overcome. And so this forces us to examine our own challenges in our own lives about why there's pain in our life. Why is there disappointment in our life? And that's what conflict in the story is going to convey to us. Good stories are going to tell about what the character did to fix that problem or to overcome that conflict. And this is going to lead to lead to my next point, and that is that good stories show the resolution to that conflict and give us hope for our own stories in our own life. So the point of this is not to say, oh, I'm going to go be just like David, because David did some bad things, or I'm not just going to go be like Abraham or whoever in the Bible, because these characters are deeply flawed. We should not be like them, but we're supposed to see ourselves in them, because that is going to help us see our lives and our failures from a new perspective. And then we can apply the fixes that they made in their life to change their life, to move back to God. We can take the best of their situations and apply it to ours. So if we're going to analyze a story, like any story in the Bible, there's some basic steps that we can use. And it is helpful actually to write these down. If you want to keep a journal, like you want to write a story of Abraham and Isaac when he goes up the mountain to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, we could analyze that story and write down the various characteristics of it, and we could gain some deeper understanding into that story, something that maybe wasn't evident on the surface. So here are some of the steps that I like to use. I assume a trustworthy rendition of the story, that this is the correct version, and I assume that it is inspired by God. Sometimes stories that are traditional or handed down through oral tradition are often very compact or reduced to a bare bones of the text. But everything that remains in the recorded text is even more important to the story. So just because we don't have every detail about a certain story doesn't mean that the story is less useful to us. It just means that what's left of that story, what God chose to record of that story for us, is very important. And so we need to look at all the aspects of it. And so the use of a particular word or a phrase or a description might be very important, both for catching some sort of subtle meaning that was, but also when we come to trying to find the meaning of the rest of the story, if we're trying to flesh out the storyline and see what that kind of deeper meaning is for us, sometimes we have to read between the lines, so to speak. We can, by using a careful historical, and the fancy word is exegesis, historical and grammatical exegesis, we can look at the story and get the meaning that they were trying to convey there, and we can understand it. So the first step would be a careful and specific and alert reading of the text. This is not something you should probably do if you fall asleep right before bedtime reading the Bible. Now, it's okay to read the Bible before bedtime. That's not what I'm saying. But if you're trying to do a deep understanding of a story, you want to make sure you're alert. And you're not just reading it once, but we want to read it several times. And we want to ask a lot of questions every time we read it. And every time we read it, we want to keep those questions subconscious. We want to try and answer those questions. And so there's 6 characteristics that we want to look for, and that's character, circumstances, conflict, crisis, climax, and conclusion. And those are just some general things that you might have learned maybe when you were in school. but they are very helpful when you're trying to write down the idea of a story. It's character, circumstances, conflict, crisis, climax, and conclusion. And the second point is to try and visualize the story and try and use your imagination to actually see the events as they're happening in your mind. And we want to not just use our eyeballs or our mind's eye to visualize the story, but try and imagine all of the senses. A lot of times there's smells involved. When he says that there's a herd of animals and he's in the herd of animals, that's not going to be like a sweet-smelling rose smell. You got to remember that these are earth situations. There's other senses involved other than just seeing the situation. There's smell and hearing and feeling and touch and if you notice that there's certain details or aspects that are left out, but that are implied by the whole of the story. And then once we got a good idea of the whole story, that's what we get when we just read it. Now when we read it again, we can try and imagine it from the viewpoint of each character. So it's easy to see it from the viewpoint of the person who's writing it, like the prophet, like if we're reading Isaiah or something like that, we see it from Isaiah's perspective. And that's easy to see, but if we try and say, oh, well, let me look at it from the king of Israel or the king of Judah's point of view of what's going on and try and see it the way he saw it, we need to visualize it from the viewpoint of each of the characters, and we need to look for clues that are pertaining specifically to each character, their state of mind, their feelings, their motivations. And since the Bible is usually, when it comes to details of every character, it's sparse in giving descriptions, we need to pay attention when it does. We could write a whole book on David, right? We could write a book the size of the Bible on David. But what we have recorded is a lot less than that. So what's recorded is important. And so there's also significance in names and the meaning of names in the Bible. I'll just leave it there for now. But there's three more things that when we're studying a story, we can look for. And this is the old plot diagram, essentially. And this is a super simplified version of it. There's a ton more that you can look at. I forgot the name of it. It's not Feynman diagram, but there's a name for it. But we need to be alert for repetitions of words and phrases and actions. That's the structure of the story. If the story is speeding up, the pacing of it changes, or there's a shift in the setting of the story. Those are all significant. If the story of Jesus' birth has somebody leaving the Palestinian area and going to Egypt, that is significant. That is very significant because they saw the land of Palestine as their inheritance. Why would they go to Egypt? They came out of Egypt, the Exodus, they left Egypt. Why did they go to Egypt? And so that's significant. We need to, if the use of dialogue between characters, those are all important clues. Another thing we can do is we can diagram the plot. If you hated English class and doing this, you don't have to do it, but just keep in mind some of the different elements of plot that the author is using. We can break it down into its structure, into its episodes or scenes, and we can try and ask, what was the problem in this one? Somebody comes before the king. This is like a scene in a movie or in a story, and what is going on here? What was included by the author here? What's the problem? What's the turning point? So a lot of times there's an exposition to begin with. This is at the bottom of the chart here. This is an introduction. The characters are being introduced, and the author is telling us about these characters, and there might be a sudden burst of action, and we will understand that, hey, this is the main event that we're trying to overcome in the movie, the main conflict, and then there'll be some action, and it will come to a climax, and there will be a great battle or a scene where the prophet confronts the king, and then there will be falling action. There will be the result of that conflict, whether the king obeyed or didn't obey, and then there will be a resolution or a denouement, and that is that God is always right. And the king finally saw that, or he didn't, and he died. And so we can diagram the plot. The fifth one would be, we need to consider the why of the story. Why was it included in the narrative by the writers? Why did the writer include this detail into the story? And what role does that have in the flow of the larger context? Did the writer have to tell me that he was riding on a chariot? Why did he tell me they weren't supposed to have chariots? That's why. They were specifically forbidden from using horses in battle. And so, why was he on a chariot fighting a battle? He shouldn't have been. And so, those little details tell us more about the story. What does that have to do with that in the larger context? Why was God passing that information on to us? Remember, he's passing this information on so we can put it in a nice little series, so then we can look down the series and we can gain meaning for our lives. And if we're going to tell a story, and this is specifically one of the reasons I'm giving this lesson this morning, is we've been studying evangelism. If we're going to prepare to tell somebody the story of Christ, we can look at our own actions. What details would I include? You know, what's the most important parts of the plot? How am I going to structure this thing? Am I just going to tell them, you need Christ? Does that tell them the story? No. Are they going to remember that? Are they going to know what that means? No. It's like if you asked me if I had a dog. If I said yes, you might remember that, you might not. If I said, yes, he's brown and he came from, we picked him up from the pound last week. The fact that you have to remember that the dog is brown and the fact that he came from the pound all means that I have a dog. This is the important part of the story. That was the answer to your question. If you remember I have a brown, your brain will fill in dog. It will automatically remember dog. What do you get from the pound? Well, cats sometimes, but dogs. You were asking me about dogs. And so that is already subconsciously built into those two other answers that were given. So it's the same thing when we go to tell a story, whether the story is just a lesson that like I'm giving. I'm always going to look for ways to convey in my telling information, and not just facts, but also action, dramatic action, and emotional tie-ins. And this is not to say that I'm trying to pin emotions all the time, because there are facts involved, but our life also includes emotion. And so dramatic action and emotion and facts all tie together to become the tale of what has to come to life when it becomes a story, to convey meaning to us. The second category that we looked at was poetry. It's about a third of the Bible. I really, to tell you the truth, I don't read a lot of poetry, but 1 out of every 3 chapters in the Bible is poetry. So why is there so much poetry? Like I said in the introduction, though, poems speak to us, or they speak through compact language. Often lines are very short, and they use creative language that is not necessarily literal. They link together images so that we can view the world differently by the use of these images that are not usually linked. They use metaphor to bring up imagination, and they use lots of course, fancy language. And so we think, well, maybe wouldn't it be easier just to tell me what I need to know? Well, no, and let's look at why. In life, we tend to think in ruts. We get in a rut. We know this is the case. We know this is the outcome, and we do it over and over, and we know that's the outcome. And so that's how it works. They become like well-worn pathways, right? That we walk down, and we know them, and they're comfortable to us, and they're in our mind, those pathways, and they're comfortable. And those paths tend to get deeper the longer we live, and they're really hard to get out of, even when there's solid logic or solid reason to get out of that path. A lot of times we don't get out of the path. And so poetry gives you the old smack on the head and tells you, it forces you off of that path. It forces you into the wilderness of that new territory that's off of the path. And like I said, one example of that is Isaiah 11, when we're looking at the imagery of a wolf and a lamb together. That's not a healthy relationship in our known world. But that's the whole point. Isaiah is saying there's coming a day when our own known world is not going to exist. It's going to be something so completely different. And that poetry just slams us in the face, and wow, that's not natural. And so there is some overlap here between poetry and prose. We can see this Venn diagram here. Compressed language, and it's creative language, it's artistic. It uses generally formats. Generally, it's written in a format, and that doesn't always cross over from Hebrew to English, particularly the rhyming structure and things like that don't cross over. But its meaning is often suggested or hidden within the text. It's not necessarily overt, but it is usually highly descriptive of the event. Let's look at some types of poetry in the Bible. There's many types. There's, of course, songs. There's psalms, which are the same kind of idea. There's the poetry of the wisdom books of Solomon, and it's very reflective. It's not necessarily meant to be sung or anything, but it's very causes us to look into our own life. There's the resistance poetry, kind of the prophets. Whether we look at John in his book of Revelation, it was a resistance against evil in the world. Same thing with Isaiah. Let's look at some of the elements, though. The speaker has mood. So there's a speaker. There's different elements of poetry. And I'll just go over a few of them here. There's a speaker. There's somebody who's speaking in the poetry or speaking the poem. And that speaker has mood. So that's the feeling created in the individual who's reading this poem. And that speaker is then going to use tone, and that's the poet's attitude towards the subject. So we have this feeling that's created in us by the poet's attitude, and it's all set in the scene of the imagery that poet is going to use. He's going to use words or phrases that are going to appeal to one or more of our five senses. And then there's the use of, so we talked about speaker, there's the use of figurative language. And there's a couple different ideas here. Figurative language can be either connotative or it can denote something. So if it denotes something, it's saying directly what it means. And that almost never happens in poetry. Sometimes it does, but more often it's connotation. It's an associated or an implied meaning with a word or a subject. And so they do that by using symbols, or it's just an object or an image that stands in place of something else. You can use allusion, which is a reference to a well-known person or a place or an event or literary work. And this is very common in the Bible. If we read about an event, and it says, and he went to go, and this person died, and he slept with his fathers in, and it names a place. That place is very important to that people. And it's very important to them because they believe that their dead are buried there for a spiritual reason. There's a connection to that place that is significant and represents a connection between them and God. And so allusion is very important. Simile is a comparison between unlike things, like the wolf and the lamb. A metaphor is a description that makes a direct comparison between two unlike things. And analogy is a comparison of characteristics between two things. They can use situations and a few other things here. Also, personification, like when the donkey starts talking, that's giving human characteristics. That's called personification. And hyperbole, it's exaggeration. So that's kind of how poetry works. Excuse me. The last category makes up about 25 to 23% of the Bible, if I remember right. And this last category is called prose or discourse. And these are speeches or letters and essays that bring about that logic and that sequence of ideas into that one argument that's going to require us to have a response. And so it's usually using persuasive reasoning. Discourse forces us to think logically and consistently and then do something about it. That's the important part. We can define discourse several different ways. If we're going to try and give a definition to the word, it could be described in formal terms about the actual little bits of units that make up the language, so the actual words. But discourse generally is the meaning that is what I said before is above the sentence. It's the meaning of what the sentence is. That's what discourse is. And it has to do with the collective meaning of the words together that are being communicated in the sentence. So we have sounds. I can make a sound of a letter. We put those letters together into a word structure. We call that morphology. We put words themselves into lexicology. That's the study of words. And then sentence structure, how we put those sentences together, is called syntax. And then above the sentence, so the sentence as a whole, the meaning of that sentence as a whole is called discourse. And that's how we can study laws and wisdom literature and letters, like when Paul writes a letter to the Corinthians, like we're going to study in the evening. That's prose or discourse. He's telling them, he's using logical arguments. So we can define discourse generally as language or a behavior that's linked to a certain practice. And there's a lot of different types of situations, and so there's a lot of different types of prose or discourse that is appropriate to each one. For example, if I'm writing a law, like in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it might be one type of literature. But if I'm going to tell somebody very lovingly that they're doing something wrong, and I'm making an argument for that, I might write it in a letter, and I write it in that form. So it's very different. For example, legal documents. When we write a will or a business document, that's not anything like what we would write to our friend and tell them they're doing something wrong. And so there's just a great amount of depth and information that's conveyed via prose. But we also see that in the Bible. Kind of putting all these ideas together this morning, though, every biblical book is a combination of literary styles. There's not just one literary style that goes throughout the book. To read that book well, to read that book of the Bible well, and to grasp its true meaning, you need to be familiar with each type of literature that's being presented to you and how it works. It's really only after we understand that literature at that deeper level are we going to get the true meaning of those passages and how we can apply them to our lives. So, some of these passages we've been reading our whole life. Some of us grew up in the church. And so for our whole lives, more than half a century now, we've been looking at these things, and maybe we've been missing something because we haven't gone to that deeper level. And with these tools, we can know what to pay attention to and what questions to ask. And knowing what question to ask is often more important than asking a whole bunch of questions. Knowing what question to ask is very important because we might be looking for the answer to a question, but the answer is not within the poetry books. It's in the wisdom books. I might be looking for the answer of how, the Jews dealt with sacrifice. And because I know that's a law thing, I can turn to the law and go and look for it. And the same idea with other concepts and other deeper conflicts we have in our life. If I'm having trouble with a certain issue of sin in my life, I can look at how that sin played out in somebody else's life over here, and I can make a correction in my own life. And storytelling is very important in the biblical literature because of the most important story of all time, and that is that God wants us to have a relationship with Him. And I don't mean like we're all buddy-buddy, cozy on the couch. I mean like He wants us to be one with Him. Jesus said, I and the Father am one. And they accused Him, or they got ready to stone Him over that. But then He also says He wants that for us. He wants us to be one with Him. And so when we read the story of the Bible, we can find out how even before the world was created, God had this plan for us. And that was for us to be in unity with Him, to be in fellowship with Him. Fellowship is a type of relationship. And that He arranged that to happen through Christ. And so then we can make changes in our own life so that we can become more like Christ when we realize that, hey, this outcome over here is a result of this thing. I don't want to do that thing. And so now I can have a hope of something better if I decide to follow Christ. If you need the prayers of the congregation or you need anything else, please let somebody know as we stand and as we sing.